starting into a new series this week that will take us on a journey through the early chapters of the Bible. I've just simply labeled this series In the Beginning. You probably don't need to be told that if the title is that we will be spending some time into the early part of the book of Genesis. I don't need to tell you that this book is in some ways controversial. I'm not sure why it should be so, but certainly it has stirred a lot of conversation. And from that perspective, it sometimes feels daunting to be working through it, but together I trust by God's grace we will enjoy the experience. The first words of the Bible, very, very clear. The case is stated in plain language. In the beginning, God created. What we do with those words has become a point of discussion. Personally, I'm not always sure why we need to discuss that, but it really is ultimately, hopefully I clarify what I mean by that, but really ultimately what it comes down to is a clash of worldviews. I don't know if you know this word. I'm sure you do. Would like to think you do. It's just your perspective on the world. A worldview is simply the way that somebody sees and understands the world. Everything you do comes out of your worldview. Everything you believe comes as a part of your worldview. A person's worldview determines their beliefs in all manner of life and behavior. It will determine what you think, how marriage should be defined, what you think morality is, what you think politics should be, what you should do with your money, whether you think prostitution should be legalized. All of these answers to these questions come out of your worldview. And I don't need to tell you that the worldview of the age we live in is not a Christian one. A worldview is just a big picture understanding of reality. It is the way that people understand things. There are four main questions, although there are several I'm sure you could add to this, but four main questions that every worldview seeks to answer. Where did I come from? Question of origins. What gives life meaning? Question of meaning. How do I know good and evil? Question of morality. What happens when we die? The question of destiny. Every worldview has answers to these things, or at least makes an effort to answer these things. I would say this morning that the only way to give coherent answers to all of those questions is from a Christian worldview. I also probably don't need to mention to you that the worldview that is predominant today is not a Christian worldview. Hence, when you come to the book of Genesis, there is a lot of pushback from the world and from even sometimes people within the church in regards to the early chapters of Genesis, because the worldview of the world is so predominant and so loud and so bombastic that it's practically impossible at times for us to separate their worldview from our worldview. I don't need to tell you that they believe in what would be termed, for lack of a better expression, naturalism. You know this as well as I. You've grown up in this culture, many of you, and you know what you've been taught in school. It is the belief that we live in a box. The universe is a closed system. Every belief, every law, every force in the universe has a natural cause. The only way you will know truth or find truth is by science. Science will bring you to truth, and there is no other source that you can find something lead you to truth. That is so nonsensical, I can hardly stand to just hear myself say those words, but that is the tenet of naturalism. Ultimately, what it says is that there is no supernatural force. So obviously that clearly leads to the belief ultimately in agnosticism or flat-out atheism. Nothing outside of nature itself has influenced nature or created nature itself. Nature created itself. That is naturalism. That is the worldview that we live under. That is why laws are being passed the way they're passed. It is the predominant thinking. It is why people behave the way they behave. Naturalism of itself, it claims to be scientifically objective. It claims to be the only proper way to view the world because it has reasonable, sensible, tangible examples of why you can believe what you can believe. It is It touts itself as being intellectually superior to every other worldview, including, of course, the Christian worldview, because it is non-religious in nature. And it can be proven scientifically, so the claim goes. And so we have a worldview that is in direct opposition to a Christian worldview. So when we come across the first verse of the first chapter of the Bible, we immediately know we are going cross-grain against the culture if we take this book at face value. Because this is nothing of what the culture tells you. This is nothing of what the current worldview will promote. This is a salmon going against the stream. I don't know if you realize, but we had spent some time prior to this study looking at the Word of God. And I spent to establish within your hearts and hopefully encourage you within your own minds the validity of the Word of God and why we stand on this book and why we trust this book. It was not a mistake that I talked about that immediately before I'm talking about this. Because at the bottom line, you are either going to believe the book of Genesis or you are not. That's all you've got. You are either going to believe the book of Genesis or you are not. Naturalism as a worldview seeks to answer these four questions just as any worldview does, and in my humble opinion, fails miserably. The question of origins, naturalism tells you that everything came by natural cause. The Christian worldview was diametrically opposed and would say it has actually a supernatural cause, and in fact, God is the uncaused cause of all things. Is there any meaning in the universe under naturalism? It cannot be known. No meaning can be known at all. In fact, they probably tell you there is no meaning. The meaning is just whatever you make of it, and becomes very, of course, superficial in every regard. The Christian worldview, diametrically opposed, says that everything is happening and is working for a purpose and for God's glory, and all things work together for God's purposes and for God's glory and for God's good. Morality. Naturalism ultimately tells us that we decide. Clearly, if you have looked at our culture, you know that we live under a naturalistic worldview where we just make up our own rules. We decide what gender we are. We decide how we want to live. We decide what we want to do because we're in charge. There's nothing outside of us, nothing beyond us. We can choose anything we want because we are free agents to do whatever we want. In fact, speaking of free will, as far as naturalism is concerned, the only people who are truly free are naturalists, because if God is sovereign, that he would have forced us into a choice of being who we are and have organized all the universe. And anyways, they slam the worldview in every regard they possibly can. Naturalism is diametrically opposed to the Christian worldview. It is the dominant worldview that we live in. Destiny, of course, is completely unknown. Probably it would be taught that you die and that's all there is, and there's no evidence or no reason to say otherwise. You can't pull a rabbit out of a hat. Why would you possibly suddenly conjure up a fairy god just to make everything happy in the long run? It is just narcissism to believe that we would live on beyond this world, and to have that worldview that we would continue to live on because we're just so full of ourselves anyways. Of course we would think that way. Naturalism, needless to say, is the predominant worldview. And I don't need to tell you that when we come to the book of Genesis, we are going to be going head on against the predominant thinking of the age we live in. This is a challenge for us in the world we live in, but you are either going to believe the book of Genesis or you are not. And your worldview will determine the answers that you choose on either side of the coin that you fall, will determine a myriad of choices and an outlay that will continue for the rest and dominate all of the decisions that you make will come from that decision. Because your worldview will shape everything you are. I want to just give you a few reasons. I don't need to tell you this because I'm sure you've got your own. Why I reject naturalism, not the least of which is I believe God exists, and that alone does not allow me to be a naturalist. Let me just give you 4 quick examples. This is not a case against naturalism. I'm not trying to give you a seminar on worldviews. This is very quick and succinct and just a broad brush explanation. So I apologize if it feels like there are loopholes in some of this. It could be clarified and could be explained. I'm not doing justice to all of it. That is not my intention this morning. I just want to explain to you why I believe that from a Christian perspective, you have every right to hold to a different worldview. First of all, naturalism says, in essence, that nothing comes from nothing. That they believe that everything was down to, as modern cosmology tells us, that things began in a Big Bang. We're not getting into all of what that entails, but they do know scientifically that this was the case. And prior to that Big Bang, There was nothing. Now, you do not have to have a PhD to put this together. Nothing will always produce nothing. Nature cannot produce itself. If nature produced itself, it would have to exist before it existed. This is a conundrum that makes no sense at all. Nothing produces nothing. First law of thermodynamics, and I'm not a scientist, as you're well aware, is that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It is just here. Well, how did it get here? If it had a beginning, how did it start? We, for example, in this town, we produce electricity from our waterfalls. From what I understand, of course, I'm not into all of this or understanding all that's going on, but we are one of the few townships in Ontario that actually produce our own electricity. Where does it come from? Did we create it? No. We created it from something that already is. We changed the energy of flowing water and move that energy into electric energy. We don't create it out of nothing, because you can't create something out of nothing. Nothing creates nothing. Nothing doesn't explode. We can only transfer from one. Everything comes from something. Everything has a cause. The reason you're sitting on that pew is because somebody somewhere chopped down a tree, and that tree became lumber, and that lumber became a chair. Where did the tree come from? It came from a seed. Everything comes from something. Nothing comes from nothing. This is so foundationally fundamental that I can't believe we stumble over this and feel like somehow naturalism has a foothold when it begins in a premise that is absolutely diabolically ridiculous. To say that truth can only be determined by science is ultimately self-refuting. That is absolutely ridiculous. That is a truth statement that you cannot prove by science. To say that the only way we can know truth is by science, well, how do you prove that by science? Science can only go so far and cannot bring you all truth. Science, for example, will never prove what is right and what is wrong scientifically. We will never be able to say that the Nazis were wrong in what they did in World War II. There's no scientific experiment to say that. And yet we all know this is true. You cannot prove that something is ugly or beautiful. This is just a matter of opinion that would have to say nothing is ugly, nothing is beautiful. Is that really the case? Science cannot even determine whether the world was created 10 minutes ago. It cannot determine your own birthday by science. It can do nothing about yesterday. Science is not about history. It is about the present. Science has limitations. It's wonderful. It's great. It's glorious. We embrace it. And we have learned so much from it. And we're not against science. But science has overstepped its bounds to believe that it can carry on a conversation about origins, which is a historic debate. Needless to say, I'm not a naturalist. This is an aside in some ways, but it's just a claim on my belief in deity. Design gives evidence of a designer. You will never convince me that when you see skywriting in the sky and a plane goes by, that was a cloud that made that. It's proper English. I know full well that there was intelligence behind that. I walk through a field and I find a snowman. I never would imagine in my wildest dreams saying, look what the wind and the weather made. You see something that has design and you automatically know this had to come from intelligence. My fingernail is more complex than a snowman, and we are told that this happened by itself, of itself. This couldn't be more ludicrous in my mind. I'm not trying to convince you of anything. I'm telling you why I land on the side of not believing in naturalism. This cannot be the case. In my own heart, I'm not trying to convince you of anything, but design always gives evidence to a designer. And the universe is far too complex in all that it has and all that it is for it to have happened on its own. There must be intelligence behind it. Again, from just broad brush, saying this quickly. Last thing I want to say, chance is not a force. That sounds like a foolish thing to say, because chance is just a word. Chance is the word that we use to describe mathematical possibility. It is a concept that describes mathematical possibilities. But what we have from naturalism is the equation that time plus chance equals everything. Just want to say this plainly and politely. Chance is not a thing. Chance is a word. Chance is not a force. Chance doesn't act on anything. Chance doesn't cause something to happen. Chance has no ability to make something happen. It's just a thing we use to describe something that appears to be random because the mathematics behind it are so enormous. We call it chance. But chance is not a thing. It's not an action. It's not a force. It has no ability to create something. And if you have nothing, no matter how many times you expect chance to do something, chance is never acting on nothing because it's not a force. Nothing will always be nothing. And if you start with nothing, you'll always have nothing because chance does nothing. It is not an action. Want an example of this? I found this interesting. This is kind of an aside, and I'm kind of distracting you with a cool little story. This girl here in this picture is 5 years old. Once upon a time, taken in 1980, they are at Disney World. Her family is visiting. They snapped this picture. She's now an adult, I think 30 years old. 30 years later, at least, she's going through these photos, looking for some pictures to put in a slideshow on her wedding day. She pulls out this picture, sets it in the keeper file, and begins to scan them and do what she needs to do to put this slideshow together. Her fiance, who's putting the slideshow together, can hardly believe what he sees in the picture. Because in the background, there's a man who looks exactly like his father, and the more closer he looks at it, he is absolutely certain that, in fact, that is him at 3 years old, sitting in the stroller behind this girl who was having her picture taken. Two random families. One is Canadian, one is American. Neither of them lived in Florida. Both end up in Disney World on the same day, and in the same exact moment are passing by each other, snap a picture. 30 years later, they're getting married. What are the chances? I don't know. But I can tell you this. Chance had nothing to do with that happening. Chance was not a force that brought that circumstance to be that way. There were intelligent decisions that were made that brought that to be. Coincidence? Yes. But chance is the word that we would use to describe the incredible mathematic conundrum of all the ins and outs of possibilities that could happen to bring that to be the case. And you would say, what are the chances? But chance didn't do it. Because chance is not a thing. Time plus chance means nothing. Why are we so intimidated by stupid math that actually doesn't lead to anything or defends a worldview that has no leg to stand on, when in truth will always trump falsehood? We should never be intimidated by a worldview that is so loud and so dominant that it thinks it knows everything. Puts me in mind of Romans 1, verses 22 and 23. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie. Do you know what happens? Because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served a creature rather than the Creator who is blessed forever, they begin to worship and serve the creature. Now nature becomes the thing we worship. We substitute the great, awesome, and powerful, intelligent being called God, and we reduce him to an intelligent being that we call nature, capital N, and we say we don't believe in God, but we give nature all the attributes of being and intelligent and design. We worship nature. And that is what has happened in the world that we live in. This is the substitution that happens when a man, when a woman, when a child, when a human being decisively and chooses to rebel against God. If I can say this, I think this is more true than anything I could say today. I can't defend it though. This is not an intellectual problem, it's a moral problem. At the end of the day, what we want to do is push God out of our lives. What we want to do more than anything else is live free and autonomous from anyone who tells us what to do. So we do everything we can to convince ourselves that this has to be the case. And then we come along, a text like this that is diametrically opposed to everything this worldview stands for. In the beginning, that's time. Before anything happened, God. So he existed before this happened, and he is the intelligence behind all that happened. It's got nothing to do with nature. Now, I don't know if you know this. I'm sure you do. But there are so many pressures on the church against this text, and with the voice of naturalism so loud and clear, that Christians themselves have begun to question this text. And they're asking the question, is this text to be understood? Is it literally history, or is it a metaphor? I'm only saying everything I'm saying this morning is preliminary. We're not getting into this book until next week, but you need to know, this is groundwork that you need to know how we're going to approach this text. Is this book an allegory? Are these chapters an allegory? Is this a story? Is Adam representative of something, of the human race, and Eve representative of something in the human race? And we have a lesson to learn from this. Is it an allegory or is it history? Well, how would you find out? First thing you would ask yourself is that, does the text read as if it's meant to be understood as a metaphor? Well, there are some interesting things in it, clearly. Tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Serpent that's speaking. But by and large, overall, when you read the text, I'm asking you, does it read to you like the reader is supposed to assume this represents that, this represents that, this means that, this is something? When you just read it, what's your honest first reading of it? Do you feel like you're supposed to understand this in any other way other than literal? I'm just asking you. To me, there's nothing in the text that would say to me, when you read the book of Revelation, do you say, oh, I think this book is literal? There's a woman sitting on a mountain of 10 hills. She is a very big woman. Is that what you read when you read that text? No. You know when you read a text that there's something beyond the text. There's no Hebrew parallelisms. There's no chiastic structure as we saw in the book of Psalms. There's not happening in this. It's not poetry. That's my opinion. That's my response. And I have to ask this question. Is there any outside pressure? Is there any reason from anything outside of just the text itself that would make us think that we should read this text as an allegory? Yeah. Everybody who wants to make some sort of a acquiescence kind of not look like a fool to the naturalists out there who we don't want to stand up and stand out and say, we don't believe your story on how we got going. So we feel obligated, many Christians do, to somehow meld these two together. And we feel such pressure, such bombastic, loud voices that somehow we feel obligated to take everything that they're saying and say, well, maybe we can fit it in here somewhere. Maybe this goes between verse 1 and verse 2. Maybe there's a little bit of something happening. Very common idea. Very prominent, very hip, very cool, very modern. You go to many, many seminaries today, you'll get courses, exactly what I've said to you, how to fit all these ideas into that text. Very common idea, which I utterly and absolutely reject, just for the record. Call me a square, put me in the classification of a weirdo, tell me I'm not progressive, I'm not educated, I don't care. The text is the text, and you can't mess with the Word of God. You know what we're doing? The illustration that I told you already from last week, we are putting ourselves over the book, and we are now deciding from our own perspective what should be in the book. What's our perspective? The book is over us. We submit to the book. I can't help it that the book strikes us as that. I can't help it that that puts us in a position that's diametrically opposed to the culture. I can't help it that it puts us against the wall and makes us sound strange. It's not my fault. I am of the book. Here's a question you have to ask. Where does the Bible, if it's allegory, if it's not literal, then where does the Bible start to become literal? How do you know where that line is? Is it Noah? Yeah, I don't know. Maybe Abraham? Jacob? Moses may? How do you know? How do you know where the lines are? And another thing, read the book. The book does not read like it thinks you're supposed to read this as a metaphor. Genesis 5:1. This is the book of the generations of Adam. So it treats Adam like these are his. What's a generation? If this is a metaphor of an idea, how does this make any sense? Chapter 6, verse 9. These are the generations of Noah. Chapter 10, verse 1. These are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Do you see a pattern forming with the book of Genesis? Genesis 11, verse 10. These are the generations of Shem. This book actually treats these people like they're historic people, right back to Adam. Adam's children, Noah's children, Noah's children's children, Shem. These are the generations of Terah, for Genesis 11, 27. Genesis 25, 12. These are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son. Genesis 25, 19. These are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. These are the generations of Esau, father of the Edomites, Genesis 36, 9. Genesis 37, 2. These are the generations of Jacob. Why does the book treat itself like it's a history book if it's not a history book? I have to ask this question. What do you do at the end of the Bible? If you're going to try and fit some millions of years into this, if you're going to say that there was some process that God used in creation, if you're going to fit naturalism into the scriptural text, then what do you do at the end of the Bible when God uncreates everything? 2 Peter 10. The day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. Is that a day that's a literal day? Or is that an epoch of time? Then the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved, and the earth and the works and all that are done on it will be exposed, waiting for and hastening the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be set on fire and dissolved, and the heavenly bodies will melt as they burn. But according to his promise, we are waiting for a new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. Let me ask you something. Is the new heaven and the new earth going to take millions of years? Is that going to be a process of everything burning up? Is God's uncreation of the universe going to take time? Is this something that God's going to do in a moment, in an instant? Well, the only reason that makes sense, that this is in a moment, in an instant, is because that's what the book started as. The book begins that God made everything in a moment, in 6 days, in an instant, 6 days, and at the end of all things, he's going to uncreate everything, and he's going to make a new heaven and a new earth, and everything is going to be exactly as it was in the beginning. The Bible is bookends. We have no reason to look at this as if anything other than history. Strange as that sounds, the Bible itself speaks about God as if he is the creator. Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator, the ends of the earth. He created by the word of the Lord. The heavens were made, the breath of the mouth, all their host. Psalm 33, 6. The word of the Lord, what does that put in mind? And God said, let there be, and there was. By the word of the Lord, the heavens were made. That's what the rest of the text says. Is David wrong? Did David read the book of Genesis and get confused and not know? And he's now made a mistake that he said God spoke, and there it is? Psalm 33, verses 8 and 9. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. For he spoke, and it came to be. He commanded, and it stood firm. That's what the text says. Is the Bible contradicting itself? That in the early chapters, it's just a metaphor, it's a picture, it's long ages, it's a whole big story, and now all of a sudden they're saying he spoke? Who's right? If you don't take the first part literally, none of it makes sense. Psalm 102, verses 25, 26. Of old you laid the foundation of the earth. The heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will remain. They will all wear out like a garment. We find even into the New Testament, Jesus is pointing out here that Adam and Eve were real, historical people. Middle of the context, I'm just going to read this to you. Verse 4 of Matthew 19. He answered, have you not read That he who created from the beginning made male and female, and said, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Jesus believed that God created two people. Is Jesus wrong? What? Do I need to tell you who Jesus was? Do I need to tell you who Jesus was? Read a text in a few minutes that'll tell you who Jesus was. And from the beginning created, and he treats them like they're historic people. Luke 3. This is the genealogy, the lineage of Jesus. Luke gives the lineage of Jesus from Jesus that begat, and he goes all the way down, and look what he does. This is the end of the text, Luke 3, verse 37, 38. The son of Methuselah, the son of Enoch, the son of Jared, the son of Mahalalel, the son of Canaan, the son of Enos, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, the son of God. Now, if Adam is just an allegorical figure, then what is Luke doing throwing him into a genealogy of historic people? Luke believed he was a real person. Acts 15, verse 15. Men, why are you doing these things? We are also men like you. Again, just leaping into the context of Paul trying to keep people from worshiping them. We are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. Paul clearly attributes all of creation to God. And here's the text about Christ himself. For by him, and that's Christ, you read the context. Whoops, I hit this button by mistake. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. He is before all things. Before anything existed, he existed. Before all things, and in him all things hold together. He's the one who sustains the universe. The God who started it all is Christ himself. He was the one who in the beginning who said, let there be, and there was. I don't think Hebrews 11:3 could be any more clear. Thank you for belaboring my point with me. By faith, we understood that the universe was created by the Word of God. Is he wrong? Is the writer of Hebrews mistaken because he doesn't realize that the first chapters are just a story and just some sort of a picture for us to learn a lesson? They were created by the Word of God so that, listen to this, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. There is no room in that text to say that things made themselves and adapted to a point that they are now existing as they exist. They were not made out of the things that already were, things that were already visible. They did not come from things that already existed. There was not a process that took place. By faith, we understand that the universe was created by the Word of God so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. Things that were invisible, God spoke and became visible. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 13 and 14, my last text, you'll be happy to know. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. Why is he talking about these people if they're not historical people? And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. I can't read that text any other way but to believe that Paul knew full well what he was talking about and who he was talking about. Is it radical? Yeah. Is it different? Oh, yeah. Is it completely non-mainstream? Oh, yeah. Does it cut across the exact grain of the culture? You better believe it. Does it stand diametrically opposed to everything that the world believes? Bring it on. There's a little story. Match it up to our little story. Let's see where the truth falls, and let's see what story stands at the end of it all. Because at the end of the day, we have as much right to believe this text and to hold this text in such high esteem that we would read it as the Word of God, that we would take it as the Word of God, and then we would look at it as if God meant this to be understood as literal, historic reality that begins to describe everything we need to know about where we come from And this is the beginning of a worldview that shapes everything else you believe. Because when you take the worldview, another worldview, and you try to meld it with a Christian worldview, you're going to come up with a whole different kettle of fish than a Christian worldview. You're going to end up down a road that's got a bit of compromise here, that pushes that in there, that pushes this in there, and allows for this, and suddenly you're not even a Christian worldview. Probably not making any sense to you,